My grandmother was already very old when she died. She treated me with great love, was very affectionate to me, even more so than my own mother. It seemed to me that there was no one kinder than her in the whole world. Perhaps this love for me was due to the fact that I was very much like my father, her son. It was said that he and I had the same face. My grandmother raised her son alone. Her husband, my grandfather, left her as soon as she became pregnant. At first my grandmother was very worried. She didn't think my grandfather had left her. It was a time of repression in Russia. Many people were taken away in black cars for good. But the reason for grandfather's disappearance turned out to be much simpler and more offensive. 6 months after my grandfather disappeared, he simply sent my grandmother a letter. "Honey, forgive me, I met another woman and fell in love with her. Don't look for me." It was as if my grandmother had been hit on the head. Not only had a man betrayed her, but she was about to have a baby. And at that time it was very difficult to raise a child alone. In due time, a strong and healthy boy was born, my father. My grandmother named him after the man who had betrayed her, the baby's father. My grandmother just kept on loving him very much. She told my son all his childhood that his father died in the north, and she revealed the truth only 20 years later. And my father spent the rest of his life hating his father, who betrayed them. The only memory I have left of him is the red handkerchief my grandfather gave my grandmother when he was still caring for her. There was also a picture of my grandfather, which my grandmother wrapped in the same red handkerchief and carefully kept in an old wooden box. Time was passing. My grandmother worked 3 jobs so that my father could graduate with dignity from high school and then from engineering school. Dad grew up to be a smart guy, but he was kind of spiteful. But that didn't stop him from having a family, which produced 3 children, including me. But still my mother couldn't live with my father for a long time, because his temper was too hard. And he started drinking often. Mom gathered a family council in which she announced that it would be better if we all lived separately from my father. My grandmother cried after that, but I and my 2 little brothers were very happy. Everyone was constantly getting a beating from our father. Our backs were always hurting after my father's belt. Even our cat, who was only to blame for sometimes just crossing Dad's path, suffered. My father, after listening to our mother, just banged his fist on the table and left, slamming the door loudly. Mom packed up all our things, and we moved in with her parents. My father stayed with his mother, whom he forbade to communicate with us, calling our mother a creature. Grandmother would secretly run to us to see her grandchildren. My father never came to see us. My grandmother justified him by saying, "Don't judge him too harshly, he's just like his father." I shouldn't have named him after that scoundrel. Sometimes, as a child, I used to go to my grandmother's house myself. Often I saw how she unwrapped from a red handkerchief the very picture of my grandfather and wept. In the picture I could see the guy looking into the camera with a smirk. Soon our mother got married. Grandmother started coming to us more often. She thought that the new family had displaced us children from her maternal soul. Grandmother constantly sighed as she looked at us, whispering to herself that we were orphans. We heard her whisper and wondered. But what orphans we are! Ivan, a cheerful and kind man, lived with us. He was always taking us to the forest to pick mushrooms, and also on fishing trips, teaching us many things. It felt like we were more family to him than to our dad. Ivan even took care of my grandmother, always giving her some meat or candy for the holiday. When I turned 23, my grandmother died. Our father drank himself to death. My mother and I buried my grandmother. Ivan also helped a lot. It was cold and uncomfortable in my grandmother's apartment, and my father drank as much as he could. After the funeral, some more time passed. My father called in the middle of the night, drunk, shouting something into the phone. We could not make out his words, only that he was dreaming about our grandmother and asking him for something. Then my father began to call more and more often, complaining that he was constantly visited in his dreams by his dead mother, and asking for a red handkerchief. We patiently listened to him and hung up, thinking that Dad was just drunk out of his mind. Dad started calling every day, saying that his grandmother had had enough of him with some red handkerchief. Mom was already saying that one of us should go to him and look for the box with the handkerchief, but none of us wanted to go to my drunken father. Then the calls stopped. Neighbors once told us that our father was suddenly invisible and unheard of. Still, we went to see him and found our father dead in his apartment. The doctor determined the cause of death to be a stroke. A few days after my father's funeral, I dreamt of my grandmother. She was crying and asked me to bring her the same red handkerchief from the box, saying that her son was no longer her helper. My grandmother asked me to bring the handkerchief to her grave and tie it on the cross. I did not pay attention to the dream at first, but I had a second dream about my grandmother, and I still went to her apartment to look for that very handkerchief. I found it in the same old box. It was lying among a pile of old things. My mother and I took the handkerchief to my grandmother's grave and tied it to the cross, just as my grandmother had asked. We sat at the grave and remembered our grandmother. The dream stopped after that. Apparently, my grandmother was relieved to receive her commemorative handkerchief from her unfit, but still adoring, husband. That's what love means. I keep a picture of my grandfather. Sometimes I look at it and think he must have ended badly. It couldn't have been otherwise, since he hurt such a bright person as my beloved grandmother.